Okay, great. Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Cyber Law Society and our wonderful event, Artificial Intelligence, the next big privacy controversy. I'd like to first begin by giving a special thank you to the Law and Science Student Association at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law for co-sponsoring this event. A special thanks to Alec and Alicia for all of your wonderful help throughout the weeks to coordinate and set up this event. We're so excited to do this with you. By way of introduction, I will leave it to our panelists to introduce the topic, but I did want to give a shout out to Professor Marchant because I was a student at Arizona State University. And through the undergraduate program, you can take classes at the law school for undergraduate credit. And it was actually your class, Professor Marchant, that got me interested in tech law in the first place. And the reason why I applied to do the Tech Law Scholars Program here at Georgetown Law. So a lot of the credit should be given to you.
Wonderful. Well, it's a great program you have there, I know, at Georgetown. So congratulations.
Of course. And by the way, if anyone is interested in the Cyber Law Society, all of our events are public this year. And for those who missed, you can watch them on our YouTube channel. So all of our links are posted below. But without any further ado, let's hand it off to our speakers to introduce themselves and the topic and this wonderful discussion.
Great. So we're going to do a little tag team here where I'm going to go first. And my name is Gary Marchant, and I'm a law professor at ASU, do various law and technology things, including faculty director of our Center for Law, Science, Innovation, and doing a lot of cool things in AI right now in terms of international standards and research projects and other things. So really interested in this topic. Professor Royal, do you want to introduce yourself before I get started?
Yeah, happy to do so. Thank you. So I'm Kay Royal. I co-teach with Professor Marchant in a privacy, big data, and emerging technology class. Of course, I'm a faculty, and I also received their certificates through Law, Science, and Innovation when I was a student there. So one of the first. So absolutely love the program and love being part of the program now. And thank y'all for having me.
Great. So we're really excited about the topic we're going to talk about tonight. You know, we teach a course of all these different technologies and privacy they present, but I really do think AI is really another level up in terms of the number of issues and concerns it raises, but also the benefits. So I'm going to give a brief introduction of what is AI and then give you some examples, just sort of a smorgasbord of different examples of where AI is creating some tensions or concerns about privacy. And then Professor Royal will then take it over for parts 3 and 4. She's a privacy professional. And so she can try to, sort of estimate where our existing laws are going to fit onto these technologies and maybe where we may go in the future, although there's no perfect solution, as I'm sure she'll say. So let me start with what is AI. It's when any machine exhibits cognitive skills and basically has learning, reasoning, or sensory processing. There's sort of two different types of AI. There's narrow AI and there's artificial general intelligence. AGI is what people like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking are worried about, that will someday kill us all. I got involved in AI when I got involved in a project, co-leading a project with a lot of the leading experts in this area of artificial general intelligence. The bad news is most of them think it will be at some point AGI will kill us all. The good news is 50, 60 years away probably. So we don't have to worry about that tonight. It's not here yet. It's something to keep your eye on, and particularly those of you who are younger, it's maybe something that will come about in your lifetime, but probably not mine. We instead have narrow AI. So that's what our focus is today, AI that just does a specific task. And we've been through a lot of cycles of AI. AI was, the term was first coined in 1956. So it's been around for, well over 50, 60 years. And it's gone through these boom and busts. But we're on the third real major boom now. And this is why it's suddenly taken off everywhere, because of some real fundamental changes in AI, particularly machine learning or deep learning, have completely created a new paradigm for AI that's really got it going full speed ahead. And so there's a number of different technologies that are all advancing sort of simultaneously that are making this AI so important and significant. And different AI systems have different components or different priorities and needs. And so I was just talking to someone earlier this morning from IBM who said we have identified 90 different types of AI on the marketplace now. So there's a lot of different things out there. But the real major, I think, change is this idea of machine learning. So that's the one I want to sort of emphasize to you. So the way AI worked up until now is basically a human would program a machine. This is called a rules-based AI because all the machine did was simply implement rules that a human had written for them in computer programming. And so a good example of this is IBM's Deep Blue, Big Blue, which defeated Garry Kasparov several decades ago. And what IBM did is got a bunch of chess experts to work with a bunch of their computer programs and basically plotted out every possible move in a chess game. And there's only a finite number of moves that you can make in chess. It's much more complicated in X and O's, but in our little heads, we can imagine every move in an X and O game and can always at least tie any other player, can never lose once we've sort of got that down pat. But with the time and energy and the database, they could create an elaborate decision tree for chess, where every move the other player made, it would automatically know the best move in response. And so after spending a couple of years developing this massive decision tree, it could then just play Garry Kasparov, and it just mechanically implemented the rules that the humans had programmed it to do. So in some ways it's intelligent, but it's really just pretty automatic in what it's doing. What's so different is machine learning. Machine learning is, it doesn't learn by rules, but rather it learns from data. It learns sort of like a human does, although quite different than a human does, but it learns from examples and data and learns from it. So for example, you might show it a whole bunch of pictures of dogs and cats and say, which are these, a dog or a cat? And at first it's just going to be random, but it will get better and better if you tell it when it's right and when it's wrong. And for some way, this machine basically learns just like a human learns, much slower than a young child will learn, but it can learn massive amounts of stuff and collect massive amounts of data and start to become very good at a lot of different things. For example, it can look at a human eye and tell if it's a male or a female. We can't do that ourselves. No human can do that, but it can get it right basically every time because it's seeing very small different things in the human eye that's different in a male or female. And so a good example of how this machine learning, how effective it can be, is a game of Go, which is infinitely more complicated, it turns out, than chess, because there's more possible moves in a Go game than there are particles in the known universe. So it's physically impossible to do what IBM did with chess and make a decision tree of every possible move. It just quickly becomes overwhelming and too much. So what Google DeepMind did is it got a computer program and basically trained it, gave it access to every Go game on the internet, and just had it learn what is the best move in response to every possible move it can see on the games. And it gradually learned, and it went and played this guy, Lee Sokol from Korea, who's a world champion, who was pretty sure he would be able to wipe out this machine. No machine could match the incredible intellectual power it takes to understand this game. And to his shock and surprise, the machine won 4-5 and won the championship. Google didn't stop there, though. They then created AlphaGo Zero, where instead of giving it access to a lot of games, it just gave it the rules of the game and just said, imagine in your brain, whatever that is, every possible combination of moves, and just think of all that. And in 40 days, this machine had gotten so good it can beat AlphaGo, but it has also beaten every single human player it's played. And many of the leading people in Go have now retired because there's no sense anymore because the machine's so much better than them. And it's doing this by taking this massive amount of data or possibilities and being able to comprehend that and then play the game because of that. And people watching, there's actually a great HBO movie about this. And people who are experts in Go were watching this game, they'd actually gasp in response to the move the machine would make. It was so unexpected and out of this, the normal. They say, what is it doing? And then it turned out to be brilliant because it had thought through all these different possibilities. So that's what machine learning is and why it's such a powerful technology, because it can basically take data a lot, and the more data, the better, and synthesize that and learn from it and get better and better over time, often exceeding human capabilities in various types of tasks. And so what it needs to really work is data. And this is what creates the privacy issues, is that these machines need a massive amount of data in order to actually operate it. And fortunately, we're at a time in our life in the world where the amount of data available on the internet and other sources has absolutely exploded. And so this has enabled this technology to really take off. It's a combination of the machine learning with the data availability gives this tremendous possibility for machine learning. Such that Andrew Nagel, who's a very famous person in this field, says it's the new electricity. Basically, everything is going to be run off of AI as we going forward, and it's already sort of happening. So many of the things in your life already are being run by AI, whether it's your smartphone or your Siri at home or your Google, your Alexa, your car, all these things, Google search, all these things are now being run by AI, and more will as we go forward. In fact, the IBM CEO, she said that AI will impact 100% of jobs and professions and industries, including, of course, the legal profession, which is something, again, you need to really keep your eye on. But because of the nature of this technology that basically collects a huge amount of data and then uses it in ways that we cannot understand usually, it creates a whole series of really important policy, ethical, and legal issues, including bias, transparency, explainability, accountability, data ownership, and privacy. And so tonight we're going to talk about privacy. We're not going to talk about those other ones, but each one of them could be easily another whole lecture. And in fact, in my AI course, they are, because these are also very important issues that basically come from the nature of the AI system. So let's talk about AI and privacy. Why is it such a big deal with privacy? And probably the best way to communicate that to you is just to give you a whole bunch of random examples of just AI creating privacy issues. So you may have heard of Google Street View, where they just went along and took pictures of everybody's homes and street from the street. They then figured out the AI system and the machine learning from those 50 million images, who's likely to be a Republican and who's a Democrat, as well as a lot of other things about the people in those homes, just by the type of car they had, the type of house they had, the address, and so on. And they could predict with fairly good accuracy what political party that particular home supports. In the workplace, there's now these AI cameras that will basically monitor every step and move you make in order to help increase your efficiency, but also watching you, and also to reduce injuries, by the way. It has a beneficial, but it also creates this pressure on the workers to perform every second because they're constantly being watched. And in China, they go even further. They have these AI systems. This is from a Chinese publication in January. Basically, you get deducted wages if you spend 3 seconds too long in the restroom or buy a meal while you're at work. All these different things. It's monitoring every bit of your day and punishing you or rewarding you depending on your efficiency. And so it's this tremendous pressure put on the workers. They have AI systems now that can look at an entire company's email system and just sort through that all to look for patterns or risk factors that the CEO or the management of the company may want to be aware of, some kind of sexual harassment going on, IP being leaked, other types of wrongdoing, which is very good to understand and detect that bad stuff. But on the other hand, it means they're finding out all kinds of things. And how do we know they're limiting it just to bad stuff? Of course, we all have Alexas at home and Echoes and Google's home devices. These can be used for all kinds of things. And there's now been 3 murder cases or crime cases where the police have tried to subpoena the Echo data successfully in at least one of the cases. These are keeping track. At the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, the main professional group of this, 2 years ago at their annual conference, an award was given to this paper that says you can get the AI Alexa to basically detect when there's illegal activities going on in your home and report it to the police. Why anyone would want to have those in your own home, if that's the case, is another question. But maybe they could be mandated, built into homes, maybe starting in other countries than here, but eventually being part of our offices, for example, so our supervisor can know if there's anything improper going on in our offices. They've got AI systems that can see through walls and see what's going on the other side. AI cars is another big deal. Self-driving cars. Those cars will collect all kinds of data about your routes and where you're going and so on, but they can also potentially be hacked. And that's another risk that the AI systems are presenting. There's a whole issue of discriminatory pricing, basically charging you a different amount based on how much you're willing to pay. And allegedly, according to these stories, companies like Uber are already starting to use that. They're figuring out, based on other data they can collect from your phone about you and where you go and so on, how much you can afford to pay and charging you that. And allegedly, some places like Amazon are starting to do that as well, to do this differential pricing based on how much you can afford to pay. And again, maybe that's good for poorer people that they get charged less, but it also seems unfair to get charged more because of that. We have a huge issue in healthcare where these various projects are collecting millions of people's health data sets under various exceptions and opportunities under the HIPAA statute. Because again, having millions of samples or millions of electronic health records will allow this finding out all kinds of things about our health, which is really important, but it also means these machines have access to our healthcare and we don't even necessarily know it. There's a good chance that there's one of these AI systems has access to your healthcare data right now and is out there crunching it, looking for patterns, because there's all these exceptions that allow this data to be shared. And again, finding sometimes hidden health data that we may not even know about our own personality. So there's all these apps now that can tell just by how you use your phone, not what you say, not who you communicate with, but just in one case, they have 500 different digital biomarkers of how you use your phone, how fast you type, how much you miss letters or don't touch the middle of the letter, to be able to characterize all kinds of things like depression and other mental illnesses and conditions in you based on just how you use your phone. You have AI cameras now. Some of these are ones that will decide when there's an exciting possible picture to be taken. And you want that in your house, if you're doing something and it says, oh, this looks interesting, and takes a picture on its own initiative. But there's also ones in places like stores and casinos and streets, even these CCTV smart cameras that are looking not only to take images of you, but of looking for suspicious activities that they have identified as a pattern that someone, say a shoplifter, will engage in, that you might be looking over your shoulder once in a while, or other risk factors that it basically detects and warns people. This looks like someone is about to shoplift. This looks like someone is about to count cards in a casino. This looks like someone is about to commit a crime on the street. And these smart cameras can now detect that using the AI system. They can tell if you send a tweet under alcohol, the influence of alcohol. A big one that's a really controversial one now is facial recognition. This one company, Clearview, basically scraped 3 billion images off of social media. Chances are they have several of your images in their database. And they're now selling that to over 600 different police departments to be able to identify people who might be involved in criminal activities or other suspicious things based on your facial recognition that the AI recognizes from this database they scraped from public pictures on your social media. We've had the first person, now we've had a couple who have been accused and actually arrested for committing a crime that they weren't anywhere near the crime being committed, because the facial recognition system erroneously identified and flagged them. This gentleman in Detroit wasn't anywhere near the place where a burglary happened, and the police came to his house and in front of his children arrested him and brought him to jail. He had never been involved in any kind of criminal activity in his life, and suddenly he's in jail because this AI system falsely identified him. And it turns out these systems are much worse for people of color, for women, and for men, because they're mostly trained on white men, it turns out. Who would have thought that that wouldn't work? There's these AI systems that can then predict your personality type by watching your eyes. Others that claim they can predict your sexuality by looking at your facial expressions. And there's questions about how accurate these really are, but these companies are making this claim. Here's one that can detect your political affiliation, allegedly, by your face and your facial expressions. Again, how accurate it is, we don't know, but they're making these claims they can do these things. Probably the biggest example is China is a huge user of this technology. So they're using this in fighting the coronavirus by collecting all this data about you, where you've been, your location, taking pictures of you, having drones and lights that basically are measuring your temperature remotely. And every person in China now has on their phone an app that shows red, green, or yellow, depending on their coronavirus risk. And you can't go into a subway or a bus station or a public building or a university without showing your phone that you have the green light, that your data is showing, that they're collecting from all these different sources and analyzing through AI that, again, humans just possibly couldn't do that, are then rating your risk of having coronavirus. They're using this for all kinds of street things. So this woman, police officer, has a smart camera on her glasses that's facial recognition and other factors it's identifying people of who may be of a certain ethnic group who aren't allowed to be in this part of the city or who are wanted for a crime. So China's a huge user of this AI. I was recently at a conference last year before the coronavirus talk in Europe, talking to a guy who had lived in China for 10 years, and he used an app there for paying things. And he went back for a conference, and he got out at 11 o'clock at night, and his hotel's right across the street. So he walked across, and he hears a ding, and they've just deducted $25 from his account because of jaywalking. So, several years later, they still have him in the database. They recognize him crossing the street at night and connect it to his financial records and are able to make that deduction right on the spot without him having any say in it. We have various algorithms that allegedly can tell what you're thinking and can sort of try to understand your thought processes and what you're saying. You can imagine this could have a lot of applications in the legal system, for example. This one reads children's emotions as they learn. So this is a thing in Hong Kong that the kids bring home a laptop, and the teacher can monitor their face as they're learning to see how well they're learning. Are they frustrated? Are they happy? Are they feeling good about themselves? Are they confident? And it's measuring their emotions in real time as they're doing their lessons on the laptop from the school that the teacher is monitoring in real time. Not just looking at the pictures, but the AI is telling the teacher what the student's actually doing. And they have this in the classroom as well. So the students will wear a little thing on their head, and this is what the teacher's screen looks like at the front of the room. It's showing each kid what's going on in their head. Are they frustrated? Are they bored? Are they paying attention? It's basically flashing up some 7 different categories of thought or mental status that the teacher can see in real time and see how each of their kids are doing. I mean, this would be great in law school, right? If the teacher could see who's paying attention and who isn't, and call on those who are goofing off or looking at Facebook or watching funny memes or something. I think that'd be great. Lip reading accuracy is better with using these machine learning, so they can look at a room and read what you're saying from your lips, even though if they can't hear you. So again, taking away secrets. Detecting personality traits and so on from CCTV cameras and other types of remote watching you, but also seeing things about your personality. Here's one that spots liars in the real courtroom. You can have an app on your phone and have it facing someone who's testifying, for example, or a lawyer, and it will detect allegedly if they're telling the truth or not, and give you a warning if they're not. This one allows you to visualize what people are thinking about with an amazing accuracy to actually picture what things are doing. There's one product being marketed that allegedly can can provide a picture of who you're thinking about if you witnessed a crime. That's better than you can describe to a police sketch artist. That's a more accurate picture than it just by reading your brain what it's actually seeing. Again, these are cameras detecting suspicious activity and alerting people before you commit anything wrong. This is a fascinating episode of 60 Minutes of the Media Lab at MIT. This gentleman has this device he attaches to the side of the head, and it directly connects his brain with the internet. And so the questioner said, what's the capital of Bulgaria and what's its population? And he basically, without touching anything or anything like that, is doing a Google search by thinking, what is the capital of Bulgaria? He's getting the answer, Sofia. and here's its population, and recites immediately back the population. They ask him what's some huge number divided by some other huge number. And again, he's just basically putting it into a Google type search by thinking it, and immediately states the answer. And then they ask him, can you order us a pizza? He says, I've never done that before. What kind of pizza? And he says, okay, there's a Domino's a pepperoni pizza on the way. He thinks it, he's sending the email through his brain, connecting to the internet and sending it to Domino's. And 20 minutes later, Domino's shows up with the pizza. So again, this is a technology that exists in a prototype form. It's not commercially available yet, but it probably will be in a few years. Just think of the implications of this if our brains are connected to the internet through this type of technology. How will education change? How will court testimony change if the witness up there can be communicating with all kinds of people in real time to guide him or her how to answer questions? And then I think one of the most scary things of AI is this deep fake technology, where AI can make fake pictures or fake videos of people that are incredibly accurate by scanning the internet for any other pictures of your face or someone similar's mouth and other shapes in it, and then creating a video that's very hard to detect whether it's true or not. I went to a conference in Switzerland about a year ago, a lot of the leading experts in this, and they think within another year or so, it'll be completely impossible to tell if a video is fake or not. And we're using a lot of videos in the courtroom now because people have their cell phone videos, we have body cameras, we have CCTV cameras, so videos are being used all the time in our courtrooms. We're not capable as judges and lawyers to understand which of these have been faked or not. We just assume if we can see it with our own eyes, it's real, but it may not be now. And this can also be, affecting the news, for example, of fake political stories. So those are just a smattering of just a bunch of examples I just threw together. I don't want to leave you with a pessimistic view, though, because I think AI is amazing in what it can do, but also it can help with privacy. So here's an article saying that AI will be a blessing for privacy because it will allow you to look for all kinds of things to basically determine whether there's privacy violations and detect them earlier. A lot of the technologies being developed to enhance technology are using AI, enhance privacy are using AI. It could scan the internet for data privacy violations immediately and notify you and catch them before you're actually harmed by these data violations. And then it can do all kinds of other things in terms of like stopping mass shootings. Here's an example of using AI to listen for illegal loggers in Indonesia, for example. It's just amazing the various applications of this technology for good. But there's clearly a huge downside in terms of privacy, as well as all these other problems I identified earlier that we're not talking about right now. So there really needs to be an appropriate policy and legal response. And for that, I'll turn it over to Professor Royal to tell us the answer.
I love it how you do that. One day I'm going to figure out how Professor Marchant has all the fun pieces and me not so much. I get the law parts. That's what everybody says when I come in to work with them is, oh no, here comes the compliance person. So let me share my screen real quick. I only have 3 monitors and I never can figure out which one it's supposed to be on. So it should be on here now on regulating AI. I tried to make sure I removed anything from my company. That way I don't give anyone the impression I was doing this on work time. So,
which of course you weren't.
Of course I wasn't, of course. Not that they get any of my personal time, right?
Right.
So how do we regulate AI? So this is a question that comes along. Professor Marchant showed you a lot of uses for what we do with AI, both good and perhaps not so good uses, right? So how do you regulate it? Well, there are very few clear laws that specifically address the use of AI itself. The European Union is the most active in data protection laws. If you've heard of the General Data Protection Regulation, I see some heads nodding there. Okay, great. So they regulate data in general. So all the concerns that you might have over artificial intelligence, you would like to think those are regulated under omnibus data protection or omnibus privacy law. The General Data Protection Regulation actually does have an automated decision-making component to it. And so a lot of companies that don't use AI are also worried about this automated decision making because they're like, well, how do we know it's automated? How do I put a human in the mix? Funny enough, the companies using AI don't question the automated decision making component. They know they shouldn't. You can't explain what's there. So if we look at the aspects or the specific uses, that's usually where you're going to find the regulation. So if you look at facial recognition, as Professor Marchant was telling you, especially the one about they can tell if kids are watching the screen for remote education purposes, or autonomous vehicles, privacy and data protection, or one that is really controversial, the lethal autonomous weapon systems that they call killer robots, which there are both defensive and offensive approaches to it. But what about ethics in using AI? Do we have regulations or frameworks that tell us where we should be ethical? Because if you're not, you have bias concerns, right? I co-host a podcast called Serious Privacy, and I can't tell you how many episodes now that bias comes up or social justice comes up in a privacy podcast. I swear it's like every single one that we have. And it probably wouldn't be surprising to you to find out that most governments are taking a wait and see approach. We're not going to regulate it because the tech moves too fast, right? So if we get into the ethical issues, I love this by the World Economic Forum. They put out the top 9 ethical issues in artificial intelligence. So I'm going to start with the ethics first. This is what they say we need to consider. Unemployment. What happens after the end of jobs? Inequality. How do we distribute the wealth created by machines? Humanity. How does it affect our behavior and interactions? Artificial stupidity, which I find hilarious. How do we guard against mistakes? Racist robots. How do we eliminate the bias? Security. How do we keep it safe? Evil genies. Now, the first time I saw this article, I had to go and read it because I thought they meant evil geniuses. But no, they meant evil genies, like genies in a bottle. How do we protect against unintended consequences? Singularity. How do we stay in control of a complex intelligence system? And then robot rights. How do we define the humane treatment of AI? And y'all are a generation much, much after me. But, you know, you can't help but think of the movies all about robots taking over the world, right? That's what comes to mind. So here is Cognilytica actually studies especially AI and the laws and the regulations that are around it. So I love their graphic around here. That European Union is the most active. 21 or 31 countries have data privacy regulations currently in discussion about autonomous vehicles. Only one country has passed legislation to prevent the use or development of lethal autonomous weapons. I think this was from a year ago. There might be one other country since. I meant to look that up. The U.S. has a light, in quotes, regulatory posture for AI and the regulation, and many EU countries are looking at restricting the uses of facial recognition, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail for that one. And please, at any time that you have any questions, please don't hesitate to stop me. You ask me about privacy, it's like asking a new mom about her kids. So, in the United States, I don't know why that went uneven there. We have 14 states who looked at facial recognition laws, or no, AI laws, at some level, not regulating AI itself, but regulating some aspect of AI or something that it touches. In 2020, there were 14 states, and they're here. Now, not most of them didn't pass. Let's just be honest there. Utah did enact one. It created a deep technology talent initiative within higher education that touches on AI. Virginia has a carryover one that's still looking at about higher education to public-private partnerships, cloud computing. It brings in a component of AI. And then New Jersey has several that are pending. I believe they're carryover as well. But they're things like establishes the Edison Innovation Science and Technology Fund in economic development. So it touches on AI. They're not regulating AI itself, which is interesting. So since we started touching on facial recognition, let's go there. Let's touch on it. What are we doing with facial recognition? Now, I'm focusing here in the United States, but where possible, I'll touch on global laws as well. But if y'all want to hear more about global, holler. Like, seriously, stick your hand up and start waving it when we start talking about global. So California in 2019 passed a 3-year moratorium on facial recognition technology on police body cameras. Now, New Hampshire and Oregon already prohibit it. San Francisco was the first city to ban use of facial recognition technology. And if you recall before that, they were one of the cities that made big news by implementing facial recognition technology. But they were followed quickly by Somerville, Massachusetts and Oakland, California, banning it. Oakland, however, also includes whistleblower protections on using facial recognition technology. Seattle police had stopped using it in 2019. It wasn't a law. They had just stopped using it as a department. And Detroit limits their police use to investigating violent crimes and home invasion, but you're not allowed to use live facial recognition technology. Most of this comes from Epic. I love their tracking of the facial recognition, so where I can, I give you the links to where you can look these up yourself. But let's talk about biometrics then. And this is something Professor Marchant actually looks at pretty closely, but what are biometrics? And I love this slide. I only include it because it's fun and everything else I have is so text dense, you need some fun. But this signature over on the right, if you look at it straight on, it's a face, but if you look at it sideways, it says liar. Yeah, I'm seeing heads go sideways, right? Isn't that kind of cool? Anyway, that should give you a little bit of fun. So let's talk about biometrics. So you do see biometrics as part of larger laws, such as the GDPR, Canada's PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. Global laws, pretty much every privacy law outside the United States includes biometrics as part of their privacy law protections. The United States is the only one that we're weird and we don't. But we do have several states that have laws. Illinois was the first one with their BIPA in 2008, followed quickly by Texas in 2009. Washington just came around about a few years ago. California does specifically list biometrics under the California Consumer Privacy Act. New York, their Stop Hacks and Improve Electronic Data Security, the SHIELD Act that went into play in 2020 includes biometrics. And a lot of states are adding biometrics specifically to their data breach notification laws. So the U.S., we don't have a concept of sensitive data. It's kind of like others. We know it when we see it, but we don't really define what it is. We just have to take it by what are the penalties under law if you don't have it. So what about in hiring? Well, there is a bias in hiring law. Illinois, go figure, very surprising, passed the Video Interview Act, which if you're interviewing someone for a job and you have video and you're recording that video and you're using AI to analyze it, you have to notify them. You have to provide them with an information sheet. You have to get their consent. You cannot use AI to evaluate them if they have not consented to it, and you can't share the videos except with people whose expertise is necessary to evaluate their applicant's fitness for a position. So it is interesting that we are starting to see some bias, and they've already started seeing some errors in the AI which was building up to this act in light-skinned people or people with darker skin and where the AI was going with their bias. So very much so, and of course people with disabilities, people with facial irregularities, whether it was a nerve twitch or something like that, they're already starting to see mistakes, so they're trying to protect against it. What about autonomous vehicles? We hear a lot about this. So one of my favorite websites, if you're not familiar with it, is ncsl.org. It tracks state legislation. I love it. So they're tracking state legislation of autonomous vehicles. Let me pull this one up for you real quick, just to show you kind of what theirs looks like. So here, autonomous vehicles is one that they track specifically. And they actually have a database where you can look up here and see what it is. The other link here is right before this one. And it's actually pretty cool because, oh, nope, it goes to the same one. Let me see. Yeah. Sorry, it was supposed to go to the one that actually has their states where you could click on the map and show it. I'm looking to see if I can get there real quick for you. No, that's not it. That's just legislation. So the NCSL is supposed to go to that one. I apologize that it didn't, to show you how they track it. On a federal level, the National Highway and Transportation Safety Administration actually issued some guidelines on autonomous vehicles. There's also a report ensuring American leadership in automated vehicle technologies. And on that website, they actually give a timeline. And by 2025, they expect our transportation system to be fully automated by 2025. Now, think back, is it Jetsons or Star Wars? Which one have we actually seen come true? And I don't know if you've seen the analysis, but there are geeks like me who have actually analyzed the future technology both in Jetsons and Star Wars, and Jetsons wins. Most of the things in the Jetsons have actually come true, especially the makeup apps for audio visual. If you remember, Mrs. Jetson always put her little mask on before she answered the video phone. That exists. Okay, what about this? There's an executive order 13859 from February 11th of 2019 that is maintaining American leadership in artificial intelligence. And there is a memo that they put out, I think it was early 2020, to the heads of the executive departments and agencies that actually goes through and lays out things that we should take into consideration on a federal agency level. And no, I won't make you go through all this, but it's fascinating about encouraging innovation, the principles, which is public trust, public participation, scientific integrity, risk assessment, benefits and costs, and flexibility, fairness and non-discrimination, disclosure and transparency, safety and security, and interagency coordination. It goes into non-regulatory approaches, which we will also talk about. Talks about reducing barriers, communicating with the public, and later on down here, it actually gets into international cooperation and guidance on rulemaking. So it's a fascinating read if you get a chance to go do it one day. It really is interesting to look at this because we're in an administration that loves technology. Kamala Harris was a big proponent of privacy when she was Attorney General of California. We're already starting to see some privacy movement, so it's fascinating. But the technology moves too fast to regulate it. So is it better to wait till something goes wrong and then regulate it? Isn't that our history of a nation? That when something goes wrong, when bad meat starts poisoning people, that's when we're going to regulate meat production plants, right? It's when something goes wrong, that's when we're going to regulate it. But what when it's a technology that's moving too fast, that if you actually try to regulate the technology itself and not the uses of technology, are you going to be effective? Anyone have ideas there? Okay, John, Tyler?
I don't think you really can regulate it. I think inherently, like cybersecurity, right? So, for example, it's like cybersecurity is always reactionary. You never know what hackers are going to be doing. So,
and it shouldn't be. It should be. It should be done in advance, right? You should have a plan for it.
But I think because of innovation, it's really hard to try to regulate because you can't really account for all of like the possible options that someone can build into their technology.
Right. I agree. I say that's why the good guys are always chasing the bad guys, is because the bad guys are ahead of us. Catherine?
So because the moment you legislate something, some company is going to find a way around that technology by following some loophole. I think the way is not focusing on the technology itself, but what you're trying to protect. So
okay. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that a lot, and I love your last name, of course. Eve?
I was just going to contribute that I think we can and that we need to regulate it to the extent that we can. And we can predict where certain trends are going in business and AI. And if we see potential problems, like we should be smart enough to know that things
I like how you say we should be. I love that.
really, because this is such a pressing issue, and I mean it affects everyone. It's going to affect employment. I mean, whole sectors of the public won't have access to jobs. This is like what is actually efficient for humanity.
Right.
And I'm not saying we need to stifle business, but we need to make business work for democratic governments and for the future that we want. So I know that that's a very idealistic answer, but I mean it's truthful that there is going to be a point where things won't match up, and I think that
right.
Yeah.
And well, we're already seeing that now when it comes to simple, well, we consider it simple technology such as cell phones and tracking people, right? And as we've seen by the Supreme Court decisions, it's not simple at all. And judges don't really like addressing it because it's complex. But you can look back 100, 150 years at judicial decisions that say at some point we're going to have to regulate emerging technology. And they were ahead of their time in predicting that we're going to have to do it, but yet we're not really regulating it yet. So how else do we regulate it then? So your concerns about the misuse or the unintended consequences is a hot topic. Can we have standards? Well, what about NIST? That's the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. They've rolled out some initiatives for this where there's workshops and discussions. They're bringing together the public and the private sectors. They're trying to develop federal standards. There are some out there. And create some building blocks for reliability, robustness, trustworthy AI, right? So it's standards, which standards may or may not be required by law to be followed, right? You might just voluntarily follow them in order to assert that you meet a certain standard in it. Well, what about soft law? There was this wonderful quote that I found that says that soft law are frameworks that set forth substantive expectations but are not directly enforceable by government and include approaches such as professional guidelines, private standards, codes of conduct, and best practices. Now, Professor Marchant's ears should be burning because that was his quote of describing what soft law is. So, what is soft law? Exactly what he said. It means it's not law, but it's frameworks that we follow. NIST is a framework. ISO is a framework. ISO is one mainly, it's a conglomeration of people that agree and organizations, but it's very heavily used outside the U.S. as well as used inside the U.S. So what about self-regulation, which are codes of conduct? And it could be a company itself adopts its own code of conduct and says this is what we're going to do, or an industry does, like an advertising industry might adopt a code of conduct. Vehicle manufacturers might adopt a code of conduct. But typically you see the code of conduct the same way we're seeing the laws. It's on the use by use basis. It's not on the overall usage of it. And then what is called best practices. Now, I do best practices in quotes because I frankly don't think that there are any best practices. I think they're very good practices. There may be industry norms, but I don't like the word best practices. Singapore actually has a model AI governance framework. Sorry I didn't give you the actual link there. I just gave you the hyperlink. But you can follow, and the picture there is from that, which is wonderful as well. And they go through here and give you their guidance and their assumptions. And I work at TrustArc, and we are kicking off a privacy summit next week. And Ken Yang, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Singapore, will be part of one of our opening keynotes, along with Belgian and the Ireland Data Protection Commissioners, to answer questions. So I'm thinking about slotting this one up for him as what would he say about AI, just to see. Let's see. So what about this one? So this is Deloitte's framework for trustworthy AI. And we've looked at, as we've talked, a couple of different ways that people can approach it. But being fair and impartial, being transparent and explainable, being responsible and accountable, being robust and reliable, being respectful of privacy, and being safe and secure. This is probably the simplest framework that I have come across for AI for going by, but I don't know that it could actually be met. The reason being transparent and explainable. You can be transparent about what you're using AI for. You can't really be transparent about the process itself, right? No one can really explain what's going on in the black box. So how are you transparent to people? And we already know that individuals say that they care about privacy and security, which seems to be a big part of concerns about AI, unless you go into the uses themselves, the weapons, the autonomous vehicles, the facial recognition, the biases. But yet we also know people don't go and read terms of use. They don't read privacy notices. They don't read disclosures. So how would you possibly be transparent and explainable about AI? I just don't see an actual path forward. And my children, who are now, not quite so young adults, used to ask me, why did we write privacy notices if no one read them? Well, how else are you going to tell people what you do if you don't write it? I don't know how. We've talked about using icons. That doesn't seem to be working, although it's getting a little closer. But that's the part on any of the frameworks, and I've gone and looked at a lot of the frameworks over the years. How do you get transparent about AI? And that's going to be the biggest point to wrestle on. So until we can figure that out, most of what we're going to see is going to be on the use-by-use basis. It's going to be on regulating facial recognition, regulating autonomous vehicles, regulating the weaponization, regulating the hiring and the employment practices. And I don't have an easy answer. So he said I was going to have part 4, providing the solutions. I'm sorry. I don't have a solution. I have some guidelines to follow to get us to a solution. And hopefully there will be some very good legal brains that come up after us that can be part of this finding a solution with that. So what I have is our contact.
So Kay, Eve put up her hand. Maybe she has the solution.
Oh, there we go. Eve, give us one.
Oh, I don't have the solution. I know these are really, really big issues that we will have to deal with. But in terms of auditing AI, it's tough if we don't even know that we need to audit an incredibly biased system because it is a black box. So I mean, the only thing I would say is like some sort of a legislation or rule that you have to check in on your AI and make sure it's not being ridiculously biased, but it is bias in, bias out. So
right. And I've thought about maybe something about requiring ethics for engineers.
Yes,
we just hosted a lady on the podcast that she has a nonprofit that is looking at inclusion by design. So making sure that people that are involved in the design, the engineering design of products and systems are diverse, that it's inclusive, and encouraging them to bring their perspectives to the job. And that way maybe we can take it into account. But when you train engineers and data scientists, you don't train them necessarily on ethics of outcomes, because it's not that the data going in is flawed. The data going in may actually be right. If you're looking at what's the recidivism rate in South California, the data going in is right. It's just then you need to back up and look at why is the recidivism rate so high for one race versus another. And that's where you get it's not flawed data, it's correct data, but it's a flawed justice system. So of course your AI metrics are going to come out that of 3 men in a store, one of them might be more likely to commit a crime based on statistics than another would, but it's because our system is wrong, not that the data is flawed. So how do you fix that? And that's part of where the ethics comes in at, is taking those into account. Professor Marchant, anything you'd like to add on this? Since your viewpoint is so very respected and desired in this field.
There's just so much being done, though, in terms of initiatives by companies, by academic institutions, by think tanks, by non-governmental organizations for ethical, responsible AI. It's a really rich field. I actually chair an IEEE standard that we're been tasked with coming up with a standard for ethical and responsible AI by companies or entities. any entity that develops or uses AI. And in fact, we have about 110 people all over the world working on this. It's fascinating. And we have our next meeting from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. this morning because we have to rotate it around different times. And so since I'm chair, I have to be at everyone. But yeah, you know, we're trying to integrate all this and look at all these examples that people are coming up with. And it's just, you can't keep up with it. There's so many ideas out there. And so it's almost, we have an embarrassment of riches, but very few of them are at the government level. Right. And, you know, most of the governments who are looking at this say they can provide frameworks and so on, but to regulate this technology, as Professor Royal was saying, that's moving so quickly would be very problematic. So, you know, we have to figure out at a time when, you know, these private companies maybe not have a lot of credibility after things like Facebook and Volkswagen and Boeing and now Google firing 2 of their ethicists, and, you know, they don't have a lot of credibility. How can we create trust in new mechanisms that might not be government regulation, but that would actually be somewhat effective here? And so that's a really interesting challenge for everybody, I think, including lawyers and law students.
Yeah, but one of the foundations of the considerations is the ethics and the social responsibility. That's at the heart of the matter.
Yep.